Madam President Ilhan Omar initiated her statement. Her words weighted with a rehearsed scorn, reserved specifically for the man occupying the executive desk, a title I apply quite loosely. I fail to understand what minor power game you believe you are orchestrating by calling me here, but allow me to be entirely explicit, she stated. She stood with pride, arms folded after rejecting the seat proffered by a protection agent. For this was her platform, and she planned to command it. I am not one of your frightened Republican subordinates who kiss your ring. I represent actual citizens, genuine Americans, not your wealthy associates and club cronies. Her tone was a tool sharpened by countless cable news spots and viral legislative speeches. She was not merely addressing Trump. She was signaling her millions of devotees, her coalition, and the entire progressive wave that considered her a brave symbol resisting a totalitarian surge. It was January the 28th, 2025, just over a week into the president's second administration, and while the Oval Office was illuminated by the frigid, bright sun of a winter afternoon, the mood within was far from radiant. This was not a standard legislative gathering. There were no aides scribbling minutes, no photographers preserving the scene for history, and no media gaggle anticipating news in the hallway. The chamber was strangely empty of its typical energy, containing only Trump resting quietly behind the heavy wooden desk and two senior officials positioned to the flank, FBI Director Christopher Wray, gripping a pile of dense folders, and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem clutching her own dossiers. Two security agents remained motionless as stone figures near the exits, making the air feel antiseptic and precise, resembling a surgical theater prior to an operation. Omar had been called earlier that day by the Chief of Staff, a short and official communication stating the president required her attendance regarding a critical national security issue with no further elaboration. She assumed the boisterous leader was attempting to bully her regarding her intensifying condemnation of Israel and her persistent strikes against his foreign policy decisions. She had arrived ready for conflict, having notified sympathetic press contacts to ensure cameras would be present to record her rebellious departure. She had practiced her remarks, intending to demonstrate to her base that she could confront the prejudiced executive and emerge triumphant. Currently standing in the executive office, she felt assured she held the advantage, believing her media visibility shielded her and that her position as a prominent minority woman rendered her invulnerable. She assumed Trump was merely another elderly, irate male she could overpower with moral indignation, just as she had conquered every other political rival throughout her profession. She possessed absolutely no concept of what was imminent. And frankly, she continued, her volume increasing with every charge. An old man facing numerous felonies who struggles to form a logical phrase and who provoked a revolt against his own nation essentially has no right to lecture anyone. Therefore, if this gathering concerns my remarks on Palestine or identifying the apartheid system, you can keep your fabricated anger, and you are finished. The president's voice cut her off, not with a yell, but with a hushed, nearly uninterested inquiry. He watched calmly from his seat, appearing neither furious nor even especially irritated, merely sitting there with a faint, unreadable smirk, as though viewing a mildly amusing program that was beginning to bore him. Omar was briefly unsettled, as this was not the response she had anticipated. Where was the flushed fury, and where was the defensive tirade? "No, I am not finished," she retorted, attempting to recover her rhythm. "For you wish to discuss national security, yet you are the danger. You are a bigot who barred Muslims and a tyrant who imprisons minors. You represent everything defective in this nation, disguised in a poor suit and bad cosmetics." She leaned in, resting her palms on the desk's rim, her posture hostile and challenging, asking if he believed he could silence her given her millions of fans and major networks defending her. "You are a frail senior playing the strong man because that is your only skill. Your own party scarcely endures you, and your cabinet doubts your sanity, yet you wish to menace me." Trump remained unresponsive, simply observing her with that identical small smile lingering on his mouth. Omar's tone started to waver, her rage blending with a spark of authentic bewilderment, stating she did not fear him as she had survived worse by fleeing a civil conflict. "I have been marked by bigots my entire existence, and you are merely another tormentor who believes authority equals strength. But you are vacant." "Sit down!" The president's voice abruptly sliced through her monologue. It was not high volume or furious, simply frigid and final. The tone of a man who had managed massive empires and was not requesting obedience. Omar halted mid-phrase, the language vanishing in her throat, because something in his inflection, the pure and indisputable dominance of it, caused her to pause. "I instructed you to take a seat," Trump stated again, his tone still composed but possessing a hidden rigidity of steel, "because the information I am preparing to reveal will alter your whole existence, and you will prefer to be seated when you receive it." For the initial moment since entering, Omar experienced a spark of real doubt, as this was not unfolding like the political performance she had imagined. Slowly and hesitantly, she lowered herself into the chair opposite his workspace, her assurance beginning to tremble ever so slightly. Trump shifted closer, his look transforming as the faint smile vanished, to be superseded by something icier, graver, and nearly predatory. "You assume you are present due to your statements on Palestine?" he uttered softly, "believing I care about your social media posts, your rallies, or your television interviews. You are here because the Bureau has been probing you for half a year regarding terrorism funding and migration deceit." He slid one of the dense binders across the slick surface of the furniture toward her, and the noise of paper gliding on timber seemed terribly loud in the quiet chamber. "And this morning, I removed the classified status from all of it." Omar felt her pulse freeze as she stared at the dossier as if it were a poisonous viper ready to strike from the desk. Trump proceeded, his tone practical and almost chatty, stating that her brother-in-law in Mogadishu, Ahmed Noor, is a financier for al-Shabaab. The Treasury has labeled his remittance service as a terror financing body, and the funds you have been sending him, totaling $78,000 over 3 years, transfers straight to insurgents. Omar's throat became parched as she stammered about not knowing, but Trump interrupted her, disregarding her effort to speak. "Obtained via deception," he declared, plainly, noting she claimed her mother perished in Somalia, while she is actually alive in London. "We possess passport logs of you visiting her. You alleged you arrived as a refugee escaping conflict, yet you utilized a false surname to satisfy refugee criteria. You engaged in immigration fraud to arrive here," he said, leaning back in his seat and observing the pigment vanish from her features. "So here is the plan," Trump said, presenting the conditions of her capitulation. "You possess 72 hours to abdicate from Congress and depart the United States of your own will. You will forfeit your illegitimate citizenship, board an aircraft, and return to Somalia or London to reside with your deceased mother or wherever else will accept you. You perform this, and the entire matter remains silent. You may frame your resignation however you wish, citing health or family issues." He hesitated, allowing the proposal to suspend in the atmosphere for a long, painful second. Alternatively, he proceeded, his volume lowering, "You decline, and tomorrow morning I convene a media briefing in the Rose Garden. I declassify every individual sheet of this inquiry. The terror funding, the immigration deceit, and the FBI watch list you have been on since 2018. I will sign an executive command beginning denaturalization actions on national security bases. DHS will apprehend you, and you will be detained while battling it in court for 2 years. You will fail because the proof is undeniable. Your citizenship will be voided, and then ICE will deport you to Somalia publicly with every camera on Earth observing." Trump's voice became quieter and more personal, stating it was the easy path or the hard path, her choice, and she had 72 hours. Omar remained immobile, her intellect unable to compute the absolute magnitude of the disaster unraveling in front of her. This could not be authentic. It had to be a ruse, some variety of complex intimidation strategy. "You cannot execute this," she finally whispered, her tone frail and stressed, "for this is unconstitutional, and you cannot simply strip a member of Congress." "Director Wray," Trump said without diverting his gaze from Omar, "demonstrate what we possess so she comprehends this is not a deception." FBI Director Christopher Wray moved ahead, unlocking one of his binders with the systematic exactness of a veteran law enforcement officer. His look was entirely unbiased and professional, for this was merely evidence to him. As Wray started presenting 6 months of inquiry, the electronic transfers, the surveillance pictures, the birth records, and the marriage certificates, Omar understood with increasing terror that this was indeed not a ruse. This was actual, and her whole existence was on the verge of being annihilated. To comprehend how we arrived here, how the assured and rebellious Congresswoman who had entered the office ready for a political brawl ended up facing deportation, you must rewind 4 hours to when Ilhan Omar still trusted she was untouchable. Director Wray did not require a stage. His hushed, clinical presentation possessed a gravity that a scream never could. He fixed his spectacles and unsealed the initial folder, laying a sequence of detailed bank summaries and transfer slips on the rim of the desk, directly within her view. "Congresswoman," Wray started, his tone lacking political hostility, which rendered it far more frightening. "For the past 6 months, the Counterterrorism Division has been charting a financial web we term the Mogadishu Map. It began with a sequence of warnings from the Treasury database. Between the 2022 and 2024, you ordered 17 distinct transfers to a man named Ahmed Noor in Mogadishu. The sums were always meticulously measured, $3,000 or $4,500, never breaching the $10,000 limit that activates an automatic federal alert." Wray produced a surveillance image of a gritty shopfront in Somalia, stating she sent this currency through Tawakkal Express, a Hawala network. "You have informed your followers these were basic remittances to assist your family, but Ahmed Noor is not merely your brother-in-law. He is a senior enabler for Al-Shabaab. We possess recordings of Ahmed deliberating operational aid and logistical clearance, utilizing the capital you supplied. Specifically, we tracked $8,000 of your March 2023 payment directly to an explosives specialist in Lower Shabelle. You did not merely transmit funds to a kinsperson, you financed the acquisition of IED parts utilized against African Union peacekeepers." Omar's jaw parted, but no audio emerged, as the virtuous rage she had entered with was being superseded by a chilled, empty panic. Wray did not wait for her to rally. "You serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee and have received confidential briefings on how these networks are utilized to tax remittances and finance terror. You understood precisely what Ahmed was, and you utilized your position to conceal the structuring of $78,000 into a conflict zone." DHS Secretary Kristi Noem moved forward then, her look one of barely restrained distaste. She did not utilize a folder but a tablet, scrolling through a collection of formal records. "Let us discuss your origin narrative, Ilhan," Noem stated, her voice piercing, regarding the tragic refugee who lost her mother to the Civil War. "It is a riveting story, yet the sole issue is that it is a complete fabrication. Your mother, Fadumo Aden, did not perish in Somalia in the 80s. She is very much alive and residing in a humble apartment in East London. We possess her British health records, her utility invoices, and most significantly, we have the flight lists." Noam tapped the glass, displaying a grainy yet undeniable picture of Omar strolling through Heathrow Airport. "You have visited her 8 times since 2015. While you were informing American voters about the parent you lost to violence, you were drinking tea with her in Newham. You deceived on your original asylum petition. You deceived on your citizenship document. And you have deceived the American populace for a decade. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, That constitutes material misrepresentation, which renders your citizenship invalid. Then there is the issue of your name. Noem proceeded, her pitch falling into a lethal silence. You were not born an Omar. You are Ilhan Nur Saeed, and you adopted a false family identity to satisfy refugee status under a reunification program you would otherwise not have been eligible for. And the man you wed in 2009, Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, shares the same father, Ilhan. We possess the Kenyan refugee camp school logs listing you both as siblings. You married your own brother to engage in immigration fraud and bring him into this nation. Trump leaned in, his palms joined on the desk, his gaze fixed on Omar's pale countenance. You wish to discuss frightened little congressman, Ilhan, but you are the individual who appears frightened now. You should be, because the Bureau does not merely possess theories, they hold the DNA, the archives, and the wiretaps. You have spent your career disparaging this nation, labeling it prejudiced and fractured, while you were utilizing it as a private vault for terrorists and a sandbox for your own deceit. He rose, the motion unhurried and purposeful, looming over the desk. So here is the arrangement, and I am only voicing it once. You have 72 hours to resign your position, renounce the citizenship you pilfered, board a flight, and travel to Somalia or London or wherever else will accept a convicted fraudster. You perform it quietly, and this remains in this chamber. You get to retain your legacy for the history texts, even if it is a falsehood. Trump lowered himself, his voice falling to a murmur that felt like a physical burden. Or you walk out that exit and attempt to enact the victim one final time, and tomorrow at noon, I convene a press conference in the Rose Garden. I display the Mogadishu map to every news agency on Earth. I display the pictures of your deceased mother, and I announce the federal RICO indictment for terror funding. Then I have the DHS take you into custody right there on the lawn, and you will reside in a detention facility for 3 years while we remove your citizenship. Then you will be deported in restraints, with no cameras, no rallies, and no squad. Just a one-way fare back to the Civil War you allegedly escaped. He glanced at the tall clock in the alcove. The timer is running. Ilhan, 72 hours. The easy path or the hard path. The quiet in the Oval Office following Trump's demand was oppressive, marked only by the steady rhythm of the clock and the slight drone of the building's air system. Ilhan Omar, the woman who had entered with the stride of a victor, now sat collapsed in her seat, the $78,000 map, and the images of her living mother gazing back at her like tombstones. For the initial time in her public career, the rehearsed speech about fairness and equality felt like empty reverberations. She looked at the visages around her, Trump's removed amusement, Ray's clinical detachment, and Noam's open hostility, and realized that the political shield she had worn for years was paper-thin against the mass of federal proof. When she was finally guided from the chamber, she did not head for the cameras. She disregarded the frantic messages from her communications director, who was still awaiting the statement. Instead, she retreated to her vehicle, her hands trembling so violently she could scarcely grip her device. Her initial call was to the singular person she believed could shift the situation, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. "Alex, it is a trap," Omar whispered into the mobile, her voice fracturing, for he has files and is speaking about Ahmed in Mogadishu, London, the marriage, and threatening denaturalization. There was a lengthy, freezing delay on the other end of the connection. Ilhan, AOC's voice, was guarded, stripped of its typical revolutionary passion, asking what kind of files existed and if there was a paper trail. Because if there is a financial connection to al-Shabaab, even a distant one, we cannot touch this. The caucus is already anxious about the Gaza statements. If this transforms into a national security matter involving terror funding, you are isolated. The realization struck Omar like a physical impact that the squad was not a suicide pact but a political alliance. As the evening progressed, the sisterhood she had depended on began to go mute. Her calls to Rashida Tlaib went to voicemail. Ayanna Pressley's chief of staff offered thoughts and prayers, but no pledge to a joint press event. Even the sympathetic producers at MSNBC, who typically begged for her appearances, were unexpectedly fully booked through the weekend. She sat in her unlit living room observing the 72-hour timer evaporate. Trump had not merely assaulted her, he had isolated her, showing the people who held the power to defend her that doing so would mean tethering their own careers to a sinking vessel of fraud and terror. She retrieved a disposable phone and dialed a number in London. Her mother answered on the second ring. "They know who yo," Omar said in Somali, tears finally overflowing. "For they possess the photos of us at Heathrow, and know you are not deceased." The silence from the other side of the Atlantic was the audio of a decade-long deception finally crumbling. Her mother's living existence, once a private solace, was now the primary proof of her daughter's criminal route to authority. As the second day of the ultimatum commenced, Omar's legal team arrived at her residence. They did not carry hope. They carried a spreadsheet of sentencing guidelines. They clarified that if the DHS moved for denaturalization, the standard was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but a preponderance of evidence, and the proof of her identity fraud was a mountain. Ilhan, her lead counsel, said, leaning across her kitchen table, "If he holds that press conference, you are not merely losing your seat. You are losing your children's right to view you outside of a glass barrier. He is offering you a method to stay out of a cell. If you fight this, you are electing to be a martyr for a cause that will desert you the moment the first wire transfer is read on the news." She gazed at her reflection in the glass, the woman who had dared the world to hush her, and realized then that Trump was not bluffing because he did not have to. He possessed the receipts, the DNA, and the absolute lack of mercy. The media allies she thought were her buffer were actually just mirrors reflecting whatever power she held, and now that her influence was bleeding out, the mirrors were turning away. She reached for a pen and a single sheet of congressional paper. The brave warrior was gone. In her place was a woman who had 24 hours remaining to determine if she desired to be a free woman in Somalia or a prisoner in America. The final 24 hours of the ultimatum felt like a slow-motion fall into a bottomless canyon. Ilhan Omar sat in her office, the door bolted and lights dimmed, surrounded by the physical scraps of a career that was effectively already finished. The congressional paper on her desk, embossed with the great seal of the United States and her name, felt like a ridicule. She had spent the last 2 years calling for the dismantling of the very systems that were now systematically dismantling her. Her legal team had been frank. The easy path involved a quiet exit and a chance to rebuild a life in the shadows. The hard path involved a federal indictment for terrorism financing, a charge that carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would see her hair turn white, behind bars, before she ever saw the sun as a free woman again. She reached for her phone one last time, a desperate final attempt to reach out to the progressive leadership. She needed to know if there was any appetite for a constitutional fight, a claim of executive overreach, or a defense of a member of Congress against the politicized DOJ. But the responses she received were cold, calculated, and terrifyingly brief. The Democratic leadership had been briefed on the declassified files. They had seen the bank records from Tawakal Express and the UK passport records of Fadumo Aden. The consensus was clear that she was a liability the party could no longer afford to carry. The squad had effectively dissolved into a group of individuals looking to protect their own re-election prospects. She realized that in the brutal arithmetic of Washington, her value as a martyr was far outweighed by the damage she would do to the party if the details of the Mogadishu map were read aloud in a federal courtroom. The decision was finalized at 3 a.m. on Friday morning. With a hand that felt like lead, Omar signed the single-page resignation letter. It was a masterpiece of tactical ambiguity, citing unforeseen personal and family health challenges that required her presence and undivided attention. There was no mention of the Oval Office, no mention of the FBI, and no mention of the 72-hour clock. She was ceding her power, her platform, and her identity as an American legislator in exchange for her freedom. But the resignation was only the first half of the deal. The second half required her to be out of the country before the press conference Trump had scheduled for noon. The White House had already made the arrangements. A private charter, unlisted on the public manifests of Dulles International, was fueled and waiting at a private terminal. The drive to the airport was surreal as she sat in the back of a black SUV, watching the monuments of Washington slide past the window. The Capitol Dome, the Washington Monument, and the Lincoln Memorial, structures she had once viewed as symbols of an establishment she would topple, now looked like the immovable pillars of a fortress that had finally ejected her. She felt like a ghost, a woman whose name was still on the doors of the House of Representatives, but whose presence had already been erased from the ledger of the living. She thought of her children who were staying with their father and the agonizingly short phone call she had made to tell them she was leaving for a long trip to help the people of Somalia. It was the last lie of her American life. At the private terminal, the air was cold and smelled of jet fuel. FBI Director Christopher Wray was there, standing near the stairs of the Gulf Stream. He did not gloat or even look satisfied. He simply handed her a final document, a voluntary renunciation of her U.S. citizenship on the grounds of material misrepresentation. "Sign this, and the folder stays closed," Wray said, his voice flat and clinical. "The moment this plane enters international airspace, the declassification order is rescinded. You go to Mogadishu, stay there, and the United States government forgets you ever existed. But if you land and try to hold a press conference, or if you ever attempt to enter a country with an extradition treaty with the U.S., the RICO warrant goes live immediately." Omar took the pen, her signature a jagged scrawl on the bottom of the form. She handed it back to Wray, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and defeat. She did not say a word as she climbed the stairs. As the door hissed shut and the engines began to whine, she looked out the small porthole. The lights of Washington were a distant, twinkling grid. She was no longer a congresswoman, no longer a citizen, and no longer the face of a movement. She was a woman on a one-way flight to a country she had spent 30 years claiming to have fled, carrying nothing but the weight of a dozen secrets and the knowledge that Donald Trump had done exactly what he said he would do. The easy way had led her to an altitude of 30,000 feet, heading east into a sunrise she was not sure she was ready to face. The announcement of Representative Ilhan Omar's resignation hit the Washington press corps at exactly 10 a.m. on Friday like a seismic event for which there had been no warning. The official statement from her office was barely 2 paragraphs long, stripped of the usual fiery rhetoric and calls to action that had defined her political identity for nearly a decade. It spoke of pressing personal and family health matters and a need to return to her roots to facilitate a period of healing. It was a masterpiece of tactical vagueness, but to the seasoned reporters at the Capitol, it smelled of a catastrophic collapse. The woman who had been scheduled to lead a massive anti-administration rally over the weekend had simply vanished from the legislative roster. Within minutes, the vibrant, high-energy world of progressive politics was plunged into a state of absolute, bewildered chaos. At the Capitol, the scene was one of frantic, uncoordinated energy. Staffers from the squad were seen huddled in hallways, their faces pale, their phones glowing with unanswered texts. The righteous anger that Omar had promised to deliver after her White House meeting was nowhere to be found. Maya Hernandez, Omar's communications director, was surrounded by a scrum of reporters in the Longworth House office building, but she looked as blindsided as the journalists questioning her. "We are processing the representative's statement, just like you are," she told the cameras, her voice thin and wavering. The friendly media contacts Omar had alerted 3 days prior were now the ones leading the hunt, sensing that the health reasons narrative was a fragile dam about to burst under the weight of a much larger story. Across the city, at the headquarters of the major news networks, the editorial rooms were in a state of high alert. While the official line was personal health, Investigative teams at CNN and the New York Times were already receiving anonymous tips about a Mogadishu map and irregularities in immigration filings. The 72-hour clock Trump had set was a secret, but the movements of federal officials were not. Reporters began to piece together the presence of FBI Director Christopher Wray and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem at the White House on Tuesday. The narrative began to shift from a tragic health crisis to a coordinated federal extraction. By noon, the 24-hour news cycle was no longer speculating on if something had happened, but on the sheer scale of the scandal that could force a sitting member of Congress to resign and flee the city under the cover of darkness. The most telling reaction, however, came from the Democratic leadership. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries and other senior party members issued a statement that was surgically precise. "We respect Representative Omar's decision to prioritize her family's health and thank her for her years of service to the people of Minnesota. There was no outrage, no call for an investigation into executive intimidation, and no defense of her character." The silence was deafening. Behind the scenes, the party's legal counsel had been briefed on the declassified files. They knew about the $78,000 to Al-Shabaab and the living mother in London. The party was not just letting her go, they were pushing her out the door as fast as possible to avoid being splattered by the coming legal explosion. They knew that if they defended her now, they would be tethering the entire Democratic brand to a confirmed case of terrorism financing and immigration fraud. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, the focus shifted to Omar's physical location. She was not at her home in Minneapolis, and her D.C. apartment was dark. The rumor mill began to churn with reports of a private Gulf Stream that had departed from a restricted terminal at Dulles International. The fearless warrior who had dared the world to silence her was now being characterized as a fugitive in the making. The media, once her greatest shield, was now her most relentless pursuer, digging through old social media posts and refugee applications with a newfound forensic zeal. The mother who died in the Civil War was now being investigated by London-based correspondents, and the Mogadishu map was becoming a trending topic on social media, even before a single official document had been released to the public. By Friday evening, the reality of the situation began to settle into the American consciousness. The woman who had been the face of a new generation of American politics had effectively self-deported. Donald Trump had not fired a single shot or signed a single public order. He had simply presented the truth and waited for the weight of it to crush her. The easy way had allowed her to escape a cage, but it had stripped her of everything else: her seat, her citizenship, her reputation, and her voice. As the networks prepared for a weekend of wall-to-wall coverage, the empty desk in the House of Representatives served as a silent, powerful reminder. In the game of high-stakes power, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy is a secret that the president has already declassified. The release of the declassified files was not a leak. It was a deliberate surgical strike launched from the White House briefing room at exactly noon on Saturday. While Ilhan Omar's plane was still somewhere over the Atlantic, the Mogadishu map was uploaded to a public federal portal and simultaneously broadcast on every major network. The file, officially titled Project Horizon Forensic Analysis of Foreign Financial and Identity Misrepresentation, was nearly 400 pages of clinical, devastating detail. It did not just contain accusations, it contained bank records, surveillance logs, and high-resolution scans of birth certificates and passport entries that spanned 3 decades. The refugee success story that had been the cornerstone of Omar's political identity did not just crack, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The center of the disclosure was the Mogadishu map, a digital flowchart that traced the movement of $78,000 from accounts in Minneapolis to a specific money transfer storefront in Somalia. FBI Director Christopher Wray, standing at a podium in the Rose Garden, used a laser pointer to walk the press through the smurfing operation. He showed how the money had been broken down into 17 separate transfers, all designed to stay just below the federal reporting threshold. This was not a simple act of sending money to a relative, Ray explained to the silent press corps, but a sophisticated multi-year funding operation. We have traced $34,000 of these funds directly to the operational accounts of al-Shabaab commanders in the lower Shabelle region. The money Representative Omar sent was used to purchase the very IED components that have targeted our regional allies. While the financial disclosures were enough to trigger a federal indictment, it was the identity fraud section of the files that truly stunned the nation. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem presented the London files, a series of documents that directly contradicted Omar's public claims about her family. The files included British National Health Service records for Fadoumo Aden, Omar's mother, whom she had repeatedly claimed died during the Somali Civil War. The records showed Aden living in a modest flat in East London with utility bills and pension statements dating back to 1991. Most damning were the flight manifests. Since 2015, Ilhan Omar had visited London 8 times, with surveillance photos showing her leaving Heathrow Airport and heading directly to the address where her dead mother resided. The image of the tragic orphan of war was replaced by that of a daughter who had utilized a lie about her mother's death to secure refugee status in America. The disclosure also finally provided the smoking gun regarding her marriage history. The files included Kenyan refugee camp school records from the early 90s, which listed both Ilhan and Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi as the children of the same father, Noor Saeed Ibrahim. This confirmed the long-standing allegation that Omar had married her own biological brother in 2009 to facilitate his immigration to the United States. This was not just a personal scandal, Noem stated, her voice echoing through the Rose Garden. This was a felony-level immigration fraud designed to subvert the laws of this country. Every benefit she received, every vote she cast in Congress, and her very citizenship itself were predicated on a series of material lies. The media reaction was a tidal wave of shell-shocked coverage. Networks like CNN and MSNBC, which had spent years defending Omar as a victim of Islamophobic targeting, were forced into a state of stunned silence as their anchors reviewed the documents in real time. The Sisterhood of the Squad, which had once been a wall of unified progressive power, was nowhere to be found. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez issued a terse one-sentence statement through a spokesperson saying they were reviewing the declassified materials and believed in the importance of national security and the rule of law. It was a clinical abandonment. The realization had set in among the Democratic leadership that to defend Omar now was to defend terrorism financing and systemic fraud. By Saturday evening, the fearless warrior was being characterized by her own party as a fugitive from justice who had fled the country to avoid a cage. What we are seeing is the total collapse of a manufactured identity. It was not just that she lied. It is that she used those lies to obtain the power to dismantle the very country that took her in. The Mogadishu map is not just a financial document. It is a map of a decade-long betrayal. As the sun set over Washington, the Department of Justice officially moved for the revocation of Omar's citizenship on the grounds of material misrepresentation. The 72-hour clock Trump had set in the Oval Office had expired, and the hard way had begun. The declassification had effectively turned Omar into a persona non grata on a global scale. The woman who had dared the world to silence her was now sitting in a private jet over the ocean, realizing that while she had escaped the immediate custody of the FBI, she had also lost the only home she had ever truly known. The Mogadishu map had led her back to the beginning, but this time the world was watching with its eyes wide open. The release of the declassified files triggered a political earthquake that leveled the House of Representatives within hours. By Monday morning, the halls of Congress felt less like a legislative body and more like a crime scene being processed in real time. The Mogadishu map was no longer a secret intelligence document. It was a digital scarlet letter that every member of the Democratic caucus was desperately trying to avoid. Representative Ilhan Omar's seat on the House floor remained empty. a silent void where a once powerful voice of the progressive movement used to reside. The Squad, once a unified phalanx of media-savvy firebrands, had effectively scattered, with its members issuing terse, lawyer-drafted statements that prioritized their own survival over any defense of their former colleague. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries, facing a revolt from moderate members in swing districts, was forced to call an emergency meeting of the Democratic caucus. The atmosphere inside the windowless room in the Capitol basement was funeral. Senior members who had spent years framing every attack on Omar as racist or Islamophobic were now staring at bank records and surveillance photos of her dead mother that they could not explain away. The consensus was swift and brutal. They could not defend terrorism financing and systemic identity fraud. Jeffries emerged from the meeting and, for the first time in his leadership, publicly broke with the progressive wing. The evidence presented in the declassified files is catastrophic, he told the waiting media. Conduct that undermines our national security and the integrity of our immigration system cannot be tolerated. And if Representative Omar were still in the country, the House would be moving for her immediate expulsion. While the Democrats retreated into damage control, the Republican majority in the House moved with the efficiency of a military unit. The House Ethics Committee, chaired by a stern former prosecutor, officially opened a formal investigation into the Omar financial network. They were not just looking at the wire transfers to Ahmed Noor. They were looking at every campaign donation, every travel expense, and every foreign contact she had made during her 6 years in office. They issued subpoenas to the consulting firms linked to her political operations, seeking to determine if the $78,000 sent to Somalia was only the tip of a much larger iceberg of foreign influence. The refugee success story was being systematically dissected, with committee members calling for a full audit of the refugee vetting processes that had allowed such a multi-layered fraud to exist for 30 years. The most dramatic moment of the week occurred on the House floor, where a resolution was introduced to formally strike Omar's name from the rolls of the 119th Congress. The debate was brief but blistering. Republican leaders stood in the well of the House, holding up the declassified birth certificate showing the Nur identity and the Kenyan refugee camp records. They argued that the presence of a foreign national who had obtained citizenship through fraud was not just a scandal, but a fundamental breach of the Constitution. The resolution passed with a crushing bipartisan majority. Even her closest former allies remained silent, refusing to cast a no vote that would link them to the Mogadishu map in the next election cycle. The woman who had dared the world to silence her had been erased from the official record of the United States government by her own colleagues. As the formal expulsion proceedings began, the Department of Justice finalized the denaturalization complaint. The legal theory was straightforward but devastating. Because her citizenship was obtained through material misrepresentation, it was void ab initio, as if it had never happened. This meant that every official act she had taken, every vote she had cast on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and every classified briefing she had attended were now being reviewed as potential national security breaches. The sisterhood of the progressive movement did not just abandon her. They were actively being questioned by federal investigators who wanted to know how much they knew about the London flat and the wire transfers. The fear was palpable that if the Mogadishu map had a second layer, no one wanted to be caught in its orbit. By the end of the week, the House had officially certified the vacancy of the 5th District of Minnesota. The fearless warrior was now a fugitive from justice in the eyes of the law, a person whose entire American life had been declared a legal fiction. The media, which had once treated her as an untouchable icon, was now competing to find the most damaging details of her 2009 marriage and her 1992 application. The transition from Congresswoman to deportee was completed not in a courtroom, but in the collective consciousness of the Capitol. Ilhan Omar was gone, and as the House moved on to its next order of business, the empty seat in the 5th District served as a permanent, silent warning. The higher you climb on a foundation of lies, the more certain your destruction becomes when the truth finally declassifies. The reaction in Minneapolis's 5th Congressional District was not a singular wave of anger, but a fractured, chaotic explosion of disbelief, betrayal, and civil unrest. For nearly a decade, Ilhan Omar had been more than just a politician to the Cedar Riverside neighborhood. She was a living, breathing monument to the American refugee dream. On the morning the Mogadishu map went viral, the famous mural of Omar on the side of a brick building in the heart of the district, showing her smiling in a vibrant hijab, became the focal point of a community in agony. By noon, the mural had been defaced not by outside agitators, but by local residents who felt the weight of a 10-year lie crashing down on their own identities. The golden girl of the Somali diaspora had vanished into the night, leaving her constituents to answer for a $78,000 link to the very terrorists who had destroyed their homeland. Protests erupted along Cedar Avenue, but they lacked the unified focus of the past. Supporters who had once marched for her now stood in stunned silence, scrolling through the declassified bank records on their phones. The sisterhood of local progressive leaders who had utilized Omar's coattails to gain their own seats in the city council and state legislature went into a collective, panicked retreat. Offices were locked, campaign signs were stripped from windows, and the vibrant political machinery of the 5th District effectively seized up. The vacuum left by her sudden departure was quickly filled by a federal presence. As the Mogadishu map dominated the news, DHS agents and FBI tactical teams were seen executing warrants at the offices of local remittance businesses associated with the Tawakal Express network. While Minneapolis burned with betrayal, a different kind of drama was unfolding in the Newham district of East London. Driven by the declassified London files, a phalanx of investigative journalists from the international press had descended on a modest red brick council flat on a quiet side street. They were not looking for a politician, they were looking for a ghost. The neighbors, mostly Somali and South Asian families, watched with curiosity as reporters showed photos of Fadoumo Aden, the woman Ilhan Omar had repeatedly told the world died in the Somali civil war. The moment the door opened, the narrative of the tragic refugee died a permanent, televised death. Fadoumo Aden stood in the doorway, a woman in her 60s with a face that bore a haunting resemblance to the congresswoman who had just fled the United States. The interior of the flat was a microcosm of a life lived in safe, quiet obscurity, with Somali fabrics draped over a modest sofa, the scent of burning frankincense in the air, and framed photos of children on the mantel. The journalists did not have to ask if she was Fadoumo. The photo on the mantel showed a younger Ilhan Omar smiling in the very living room where the journalists now stood. Fadoumo's eyes filled with a sudden sharp fear, not of the journalists, but of the exposure they represented. "My daughter said they would never look here," she whispered in Somali, her voice captured on a hot mic that would be replayed across the globe within the hour. "She came in October, sat on that chair, and told me the Americans were starting to ask questions." The London flat was no longer a private residence. It was a crime scene of identity fraud. Journalists were shown the UK passport records that the FBI had declassified, the entries and exits that proved Ilhan Omar had visited her dead mother 8 times since 2015. The mother, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion of a world she had been hidden from, eventually admitted to the final crushing truth. Her daughter had told her to remain dead to the public so that the story would stay strong. The icon of the refugee movement had treated her own mother as a classified secret, a pawn in a high-stakes game of political branding that had finally been called. This revelation was the death knell for any remaining sympathy. The idea that she could visit her mother in London while fundraising off the story of her tragic death was a level of cynicism that even her most ardent defenders could not stomach. In Minneapolis, the discovery of the living mother was the final blow to the local defense. The Somali elders, who had long served as the backbone of Omar's support, held an emergency meeting at the local mosque. The mood was one of deep cultural shame. In Somali culture, to lie about the death of a parent is an unthinkable transgression, and to do so for personal gain is a stain on the entire clan. One elder, who had appeared in campaign ads for Omar since 2016, walked to the microphones outside and made a statement that signaled the end of an era. "We did not support a fraud," he said, his voice trembling with age and anger. "We supported a sister who told us she lost her mother to the war. To find out that her mother lives, while our sons and daughters die from Al-Shabaab bombs funded by her money, is a betrayal we cannot forgive." This sentiment rippled through the district, turning a once loyal voting bloc into her harshest critics. The sisterhood of the squad in Washington remained equally silent, but the physical remnants of their alliance were being erased. Staffers were seen carrying boxes out of Omar's D.C. apartment, and her official portrait in the Longworth building was removed under the cover of darkness. The Mogadishu map had effectively drawn a line through the heart of the progressive movement. Those on the other side of the line were now being scrutinized for their own foreign ties and financial disclosures. The fear was that the Nur identity fraud was not an isolated incident, but a template for a deeper, more systematic infiltration of the American political system. By the end of the weekend, the 5th District was a ghost of its former political self. The mural of Omar was eventually painted over with a plain, neutral gray, a silent physical erasure of a woman who had once dared the world to silence her. The refugee icon was gone, replaced by a global headline that dominated every screen: "The Mother Who Would Not Die." Donald Trump's 72-hour ultimatum had not only removed a rival, it had dismantled the entire cultural and political infrastructure that had sustained her. The sheer volume of the evidence, the bank records, the DNA theories regarding the marriage to her brother, and the London flat created a gravity well that swallowed her career whole. As the sun set over the Mississippi River, the people of Minneapolis were left to grapple with the reality that their representative was currently thousands of feet in the air, renouncing her citizenship and heading toward a country she had not seen in decades. The vacuum she left behind was not just political, it was a crisis of trust. The squad was no longer a phalanx, but a group of terrified individuals wondering if their own files were sitting on the Resolute desk. The declassification of the London records had proven that the intelligence community had not just been watching the terrorists, they had been watching the Congresswoman's vacation schedule. Every flight to Heathrow, every tea with a dead mother, and every wire transfer to a brother-in-law had been catalogued and saved for the moment of maximum political impact. Ilhan Omar was no longer a martyr or a hero. She was a case study in the hubris of thinking the world is as blind as the people you have managed to deceive. The empty seat in Congress and the gray wall in Minneapolis were all that remained of a legacy built on a foundation of manufactured tragedy. Ilhan Omar's arrival in Mogadishu was nothing like the triumphant homecoming she had once envisioned during her years as a rising star in American politics. There were no cheering crowds at Aden Ad International Airport, no red carpet, and no official delegation from the Somali government. Instead, as the private Gulfstream taxied to a remote corner of the rain-slicked tarmac, it was met by a small, heavily armed security detail and a handful of somber officials from the Somali National Intelligence and Security Agency, NISA. The air in Mogadishu was thick with heat and the scent of salt from the nearby Indian Ocean, a sharp contrast to the clinical, air-conditioned silence of the aircraft she had called home for the last 18 hours. As she stepped onto the stairs, the weight of her new reality finally settled. She was no longer a United States Congresswoman or even a citizen of the country that had granted her a platform. She was a woman who had renounced her protection in exchange for her freedom, entering a country that viewed her not as a hero, but as a dangerous liability. The Somali government's reaction to her arrival was immediate and cold. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud's administration had been briefed by the State Department hours before the flight took off. and the message from Washington had been clear. Ilhan Omar was no longer an official representative of the United States, and any special treatment afforded to her would be seen as an affront to the renewed diplomatic ties between the two nations. For a government struggling to maintain international legitimacy and financial support, the Mogadishu map was a catastrophe. The revelation that an American legislator had been funneling money to al-Shabaab via a local Hawala network was a direct threat to the Somali banking system's efforts to exit the gray list of global terror financing. Within an hour of her landing, the Somali Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement, distancing the government from Omar, clarifying that she was entering the country as a private individual and that her presence did not imply any official endorsement. Omar was whisked away in a bulletproof SUV to a secure villa in the Ilhan zone, a heavily fortified area used by international organizations and diplomats. However, the security felt more like a detention. The Somali authorities immediately confiscated her remaining electronics and informed her that her movements would be restricted for her own safety. The irony was biting. The woman who had spent years calling for the withdrawal of foreign military support now found herself entirely dependent on a security apparatus funded and trained by the very imperialist forces she had criticized. The initial meetings with Somali officials were brutal. They did not want to discuss her vision for the country or her role in the diaspora. They wanted to know the extent of the FBI's knowledge regarding Ahmed Noor and the Tawakal Express network. They made it clear that if her presence led to further U.S. sanctions or the freezing of Somali assets, she would find herself without a protector in Mogadishu as well. The social media landscape in Somalia, which had once been a source of immense pride for Omar, had turned toxic overnight. While a small segment of hardliners celebrated her arrival as a victory against Western bullying, the majority of the Somali public was skeptical and angry. The people of Mogadishu, who had suffered through decades of al-Shabaab suicide bombings and extortion, were revolted by the idea that a wealthy politician in America had been contributing to the very organization that was killing their children. Local news outlets ran headlines focusing on the living mother in London, a revelation that resonated deeply in a culture where honoring one's parents is a sacred duty. The perception that she had killed her mother in her stories to win an election in America was seen as a profound moral failure. "She used our tragedy as a costume," one local columnist wrote, stating she lied to get out and lied to get ahead. And now that the lie has failed, she expects us to welcome the fraud home. As her first week in Mogadishu drew to a close, the psychological toll of her isolation became evident. The constant hum of drones over the city, a sound she had once used to score political points, now served as a persistent reminder that the hard way was always an option. She sat in the villa, staring at the walls, realizing that the media allies who had once scrambled for her quotes were now treating her like a leper. The sisterhood in Washington was busy passing the Omar reforms, ensuring that no one could ever follow the path she had taken. She reached out to her contacts in the Somali parliament, hoping to leverage her fame into a local role, only to find that the doors were locked because no one wanted to be associated with the Mogadishu map. She was a woman who had bet everything on the idea that her identity was her shield, only to find that when the identity was proven to be a fabrication, the shield became a target. The final blow came when a high-ranking NISA officer visited her at the villa. He did not bring news of a political appointment. He brought a list of names. "The Americans have provided us with the full Mogadishu map," he told her, his voice flat and unimpressed. "They have identified every node in the network you used. We are shutting down Tawakal Express, and your brother-in-law Ahmed is being moved to a secure facility for questioning. If you attempt to contact him or if you attempt to use your remittance channels again, you will be moved to a facility far less comfortable than this villa." The fearless warrior who had dared the world to silence her was now a prisoner in her own narrative, a woman who had traded the halls of Congress for a guarded room in a city that viewed her as a ghost. The sunrise over the Indian Ocean did not bring a new beginning. It brought the realization that in the game of high-stakes truth, she had played her final card and lost. The final chapter of the Ilhan Omar legacy was written not in the halls of the United States Capitol, but in the quiet, dusty corridors of a small non-governmental organization in Mogadishu. By 2027, the woman who had once commanded the attention of the global media and the loyalty of millions of progressive voters had faded into a profound functional irrelevance. She lived in a modest apartment in the Hodan district, away from the fortified villas of the international zone. She had no political office, no security detail, and no public platform. Her daily life was spent working as a high-level interpreter and consultant for humanitarian agencies, a job she secured only because of her fluent English and her remaining knowledge of Western bureaucracy. To the local Somali population, she was no longer a symbol of hope. She was a cautionary figure, known as the woman who lied about her mother. In the United States, the Omar reforms had become a permanent fixture of the legislative landscape. Following the declassification of the Mogadishu map, Congress had moved with rare bipartisan speed to pass the Congressional Integrity and Transparency Act of 2025. The law mandated exhaustive independent background checks for all members of Congress holding seats on national security-sensitive committees, with a specific focus on foreign financial ties and family allegiances. The vetting process that had failed so spectacularly in 1992 was replaced by a rigorous, multi-layered system that made identity fraud nearly impossible. The refugee success story was no longer accepted at face value. It was now a narrative that required forensic verification. The empty seat in Minnesota's 5th District was eventually filled by a moderate candidate who campaigned on a platform of restoring local trust, a direct rebuke to the globalized ideological politics that had led to the district's betrayal. The personal toll on Omar remained visible in the few interviews she granted to international reporters. In late 2028, a correspondent from a major European news outlet found her in a small cafe near the port of Mogadishu. She looked significantly older. The vibrant hijabs of her congressional days had been replaced by more somber local styles, and the sharp, defiant edge of her voice had been blunted by the reality of her isolation. She spoke of her children back in America with a hollow, distant grief, knowing that her renunciation of citizenship meant she would likely never see them on U.S. soil again. They had grown up under the care of their father, and, according to local reports, had legally changed their last names to distance themselves from the Nur Saeed scandal. "I thought the world I built was made of stone," Omar told the reporter, her gaze fixed on the Indian Ocean. "I thought if I said the words loudly enough, the truth beneath them would not matter. But Donald Trump did not defeat me with a speech. He defeated me with a birth certificate and a bank statement. You can out-talk a politician, but you cannot out-talk a declassified file. I spent my life trying to change America, only to find out that I had never truly become a part of it because I arrived as a fiction." Back in Washington, Donald Trump occasionally referenced the Omar case during his final year in office, usually as a centerpiece for his arguments on immigration reform and national security. He viewed the 72-hour ultimatum not as a personal vendetta, but as a proof of concept for his administration's law and order mandate. He had proven that even the most protected political icons could be dismantled if the evidence was presented with enough clinical precision. The Mogadishu map became a staple of FBI training seminars on terrorism financing, a perfect case study in how domestic political power can be utilized to facilitate foreign criminal activity. The squad had never truly recovered. Though individual members remained in office, the aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the movement was gone, replaced by a permanent, hovering suspicion from the federal oversight agencies. Ilhan Omar died in Mogadishu in the summer of 2039. Her passing was a footnote in the American papers, a brief "Where Are They Now" segment on the cable networks that had once hosted her every night. There was no state funeral, no moment of silence on the House floor, and no memorial in Minneapolis. She was buried in a local cemetery, her headstone listing the name she had tried to erase, Ilhan Noor Saeed. In the end, the easy way had given her a life of quiet obscurity, but it had stripped her of the one thing she craved most, a place in the history books as a hero. She left behind a world that was more guarded, a Congress that was more transparent, and a legacy that served as a permanent, silent warning. The truth, once declassified, has no mercy for the stories we tell to hide it.